When I first went into playing this game and when I was invited to play it and review it on the channel, DRIFTCE, incidentally published by 505 Games, who also of course published AC and AC Competizione, I didn't have huge expectations for it, to be honest, because it's a drifting game, so that automatically threw up some flags for me. Okay, it's probably going to cater to a wheel, it's probably going to have very, very shallow, if any, tuning, probably very generic gameplay that's super repetitive and almost entirely geared toward the multiplayer online experience as a crutch, so that you can always say, well, even if the career mode isn't that good, at least you can play with your friends, which is what so many games are relying on these days to their detriment. Fallout 76. But besides that, when I actually started playing it, even at that point, I still wasn't sold immediately, because I went down to the sandbox, clicked on it to see what that was all about. I was expecting maybe some kind of, tune your own car, or maybe build a drift circuit, something like that. Turns out you put into a garage space. And I thought, okay, this looks kind of familiar. Some games have done this kind of thing where it looks like a free-roaming room or free-roaming world, but it's basically just a way of walking over to this wall and clicking an options menu, or walking over to that wall and clicking go home or save the game, and walk over to a door and click go to race. Just a fancy version of a menu. Well, actually, I was very wrong, and you certainly make use of the room to a degree which really surprised me. And we're not even talking about the actual driving yet, because trust me, the driving in this game is something which I didn't even get to for probably at least an hour, because I was enjoying the other aspects so much. To me, the coolest thing about this game is not even the drifting. And as it happens, the drifting is really good, so we'll talk about that in a second. The thing which I think is great about this game is it captures your imagination in a way that I wasn't expecting at all, and that is building the cars. Ever since I was a kid, when I played even games like Gran Turismo that I love so much, my dad always used to be the one who enjoyed the racing, but I always enjoyed buying the cars, collecting the cars, and tuning the cars. That was always my thing. So when I went into this game, and then I see that you can put the car on an actual dyno, you can take the actual wheels off of the car and fit new tyres on a tyre rotating machine and balance them. You can put the car in the paint shop. You can take actual panels and parts off of the car virtually and even throw them around the room, almost like a VR game. You can walk over to, for example, the car lift it up, look underneath, see what parts still need to be fitted. You can fit stuff like wheel spacers, literal nut and bolt builds of an engine, even like a quad rotor, or a boxer engine, I believe is one of the options, although I haven't built that yet, or a more conventional engine, say a V8 for example. The selection of vehicles, although not the biggest thing in the world, at least at the start of the game, there's like 10 cars, 12, something like that, but you've got the bases covered. You've got your A86, you've got your M3s, you've got your RX-7, RX-8, MX-5, the usual suspects. There are a couple of notable omissions like a Skyline or a Supra. I don't know if you can maybe unlock those later on, I haven't double checked that. Maybe for DLC, we'll see. But even the vehicles that are in the game are all fully licensed, and they're all, I would say, pretty well represented. In terms of graphics, well, it's fine. It's a multi-platform game, so it goes back one generation as well. So I guess you can't really expect it to look, as amazing as, whatever other title. But it's fine. It has a kind of a charm to it in more of a 2000s kind of way, in my opinion, and it certainly doesn't break the bank. Interestingly, though, to go back to the details, where the effort is put in is to the parts, because the graphics on the parts, or at least the attention to detail on actually modelling the correct parts in the correct sizes into the game, clearly that is where they poured all of their love. Because you get something like an RX-8, which I'll probably show in the video. That was the second vehicle that I purchased after the first MX-5. And then you start taking body parts off. I bought a quad rotor engine and started building it up. I'll probably include that, maybe some sped up footage of it. And it's so much fun. I mean, especially in sandbox mode where you can do it all without the restriction of costs. This is the kind of game that puts a smile on my face because it's more than just a cash grab. This is clearly not a game that's just sold on, let's get the people who like drifting to spend some money on a game kind of scenario. It very easily could have been that. And some racing games do feel like that. They just cash in on a specialised form of motorsport, pick one. And they don't tend to be that great of a game. This one is clearly made by people who, A, for a start know what they're doing when it comes to cars, or at least employed or talk to people who do know what they're doing in terms of literal nuts and bolts building of vehicles. And it was clearly made by people who are into this. They are enthusiasts. Building your own drift car is an essential part of that culture. It is with many forms of car building, but I would say maybe drifting alongside perhaps drag racing is up there as like two of the biggest ones, where the nut and bolts builds is really part of where the biggest amount of pride comes from in that particular sport, certainly on a street level. This caters to that so well that I honestly believe you could spend literally hours, if not the first couple of days, just building vehicles in the game. And you can get so in depth on every one, especially again in sandbox mode, where you don't even need to drive it. You could just build something from the bolts up and just look at it and enjoy it, and then finally take it out to the track and see what it handles like. There is so much enjoyment in that part of the game. Now, of course, I can't talk about that forever as much as I'd like to, but to condense my final thoughts on that point down, the reason why I like it so much is because that is the kind of stuff that the next generation of petrolheads is made on. That is the kind of authentic, wholesome, I would say magic that a lot of games have lost. Even some of the ones that we love. Why do we love many of these iconic titles from yesteryear, like your Gran Turismo 4s, your Forza 3s, your Test Drive Unlimiteds? Because they had that certain something, a certain magic. This reminds me of that, because this is the kind of game where if I were 7 to 10 years old, certainly a teen or beyond, this would have immediately grabbed my attention. It would have blown my mind with all the things you needed to put together, but then I would have probably obsessed over that aspect of the game, and inspiring the next generation of petrolheads, especially in an era where everything is becoming electric and basically a drivable iPhone. I think that is fantastic. It really is keeping that kind of legacy alive for another generation of people, and I love that. In terms of the actual driving, which I know many of you will want to skip to this point and be bored of what I was saying anyway, but once you do get out and drive, again, I was very pleasantly surprised. In terms of circuits, there appears to be quite a nice selection. I went on some of the early training circuits with the Mazda MX-5, check that out. I also went on the open car park with an RX-7 build, so a couple of different ones. There are certainly multiple variations to drift around. It's not just a big old skid pan and that's the whole game, thankfully. And in terms of physics, that really is what could make or break the experience. Well, I'm glad to say not only do I, personally at least, quite like the physics, and I'm sure based on how you choose to play the game, you can change things around to some degree, it actually really heartened me to see that they've spent what appears to be at least as much effort on making the game feel good on a controller as they did on a wheel. Because games like Gran Turismo and Forza always appealed to me because they had that respect for the player. They didn't make games that only felt good on a wheel or only felt good on a pad, because you literally don't have to choose. By catering to both, not only is it smart for business because you have a bigger audience, but it shows that at least you have that respect for your community to cater to both. This game does that, and I wouldn't expect that from a smaller title. And to me, at least, on a pad, which is what I personally prefer, I'm not a huge fan of using wheels. And of course, unleash the usual barrage of BS comments down there about, oh, he doesn't use a wheel, how could you possibly take anything he says seriously? Maybe because I review real cars on the channel. Maybe that's a good example for you. But I don't like using wheels. Simply put, I don't find them realistic. I don't like the way vehicles feel in any game. I've used the best wheels you could have at the time, such as at live Gran Turismo racing events. It's just not my thing. I prefer a Corolla, an A86. I prefer a controller even, and it feels great on a pad in the game. So to me, it immediately gets you into the physics. Are they a little bit too forgiving? Well, I think you could probably make an argument there that it does feel like it's saving you a little bit some of the time. But I think that that is another aspect of gaming that's very easy to get wrong, that this game gets very right, and that is the balance. Just like what I said about having a controller and a wheel being important, likewise, that is such a fine balance. It's difficult to get between a game being realistic enough to take it seriously, but not so realistic that you shut out people who are in that age bracket of coming up into a new game and, just will immediately lose interest if they just can't get a hang of it, or even for people who just want to play casually and don't need everything to feel like they're trying to prove something to someone, which unfortunately is how a lot of players act these days. Even with what I said about the wheel, that is that group of people. They feel that somehow using a wheel makes them a better person, I guess, which is just plain sad and pathetic in my opinion. But again, there you go. This game, I think, does a fantastic job of towing the line. It feels like you do have to put effort in. You do have to learn how to use the car correctly to get the best out of it. And the level of control, again, with a controller, is something which I've really wanted from games like Gran Turismo and even Forza for so long. Stuff like having a button to control your clutch, having buttons to control up and down shifts, including neutral and reverse, while being in automatic. I don't know why racing games don't do this. It is annoying to me where you have to choose, do you want a manual or an auto? No games do semi-automatics anymore. But I love having the opportunity to, just like a real-world Tiptronic, for example, in a Porsche 911, sure, it's an automatic, but then you can click it down a shift if you want to drop a cog and overtake something, etc, etc. Likewise with the flappy paddle DSG. You have the option of changing gear when you want to. Having that on the fly is something which I wish more games did, and this does that, and I love to see that. Having the clutch control is an interesting extra layer as well, and that is one way in which I'm sure it is super fun on a wheel. Once again, it speaks to having both audiences catered for and respected equally, which is lovely to see. My ultimate thoughts on the game are, contrary to everything I was expecting, I actually would recommend checking this game out. I would recommend checking it out, especially if you're in one of two distinct camps. If you are a much younger player who's looking to play something different, maybe you're disillusioned with Gran Turismo at the moment, maybe you're bored with the repetitiveness of Forza titles, and you just want to try something new, certainly when it comes to building and tuning the cars, but also when it comes to even the motorsport side with the drifting competitions, etc., definitely check it out. But especially also, if you are in maybe an older age group, or even my age group of later 20s, around 30, and you came up playing your Need for Speed Undergrounds, Underground 2s, Carbons, Midnight Clubs, Test Drives, and the earlier Forza and Gran Turismo games, I actually do think you might get a bit more nostalgia from this. Not in a direct way, but in kind of a reminder kind of way. It has a vibe like those games, which I think you'll quite enjoy. Certainly for me, I definitely did. And if nothing else, just try to get the chance to play the game just to use the building side, because it's so in-depth to the point of even building certain things while the engine is still on a rig before you put it in the car. Because if you put it in the car and then have to do things to it, you won't be able to reach certain things in the engine. Something which I found out the hard way the first time, because I wasn't familiar with how in-depth the game was, and I'm so used to games being so generic in terms of their tuning that I thought, oh yeah, you can just put it in and then do this later on when I get to it. But you really do actually have to think like you're building a real car. So building the engine while it's still on its stand, so that then everything's done, you put it in, then you can take it from there in terms of adding the exhaust and hooking up the transmission. This kind of attention to detail. Or for example, in most games like your Gran Turismos and Forzas, if you wanted to upgrade the brakes, you literally just click upgrade brakes and that's it. Whereas in this game, you have to actually take the wheel off and then remove the calipers and then take off the disc and then put the new disc on and then change the calipers and then put the wheel back on. Could seem very monotonous. For some people, I'm sure it would be. And if you only want the easy way of doing it, then sure, stick to, Gran Turismo's, Forzas. There's nothing wrong with those. But to me, the level of in-depth attention to detail and the thought and the clear love and passion that was put into this definitely wins my respect. And yeah, it's actually a really fun game, which I wasn't expecting at all. So that's it for my verdict. Of course, check it out if that sounds appealing to you. And if you've already played it, or if you are keen on playing it now, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.